Uh, Welcome to the Ideas Book Talk. This is our fourth book talk in the series, started back in August. And today we have a very distinguished guest, an author here with us. But before I actually introduce him and our book talk subject for today, I just wanted to say a couple of words about Ideas itself. Ideas is an abbreviation for Institute of Development and Economic Alternatives. This is a non-profit research organization which was born in June 2012, and its vision is to produce rigorous evidence-based research which can then inform economic and social policy. And our research areas really revolve around themes of governance, political economy, economic and social development, and law and legal reform. The book talk was initiated with a vision to really showcase recent and contemporary scholarship on Pakistan. So I also invite all of you here, please, to feel free always to recommend new books for this book talk engagement. We're very open to receiving recommendations, also open always to receiving your constructive feedback about the talk series and whether you find it helpful, insightful, how could we improve it, etc. So with that, I will turn to today's book talk, and we have with us today Professor Mohammad Waseem, who really doesn't need an introduction, but because it is a ritual, we will first begin with that. So Professor Waseem is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the Lahore University of Management Sciences, LUMS. He has been a visiting fellow of American Political Science Association, British Council, Indian Historical Research Council, Fulbright at Columbia University, Heidelberg University, Ford Foundation at Oxford, New Century Scholars Program at Brookings, Sciences Po Paris, Ford Foundation at Brookings, and Pakistan Chair at St. Antony's College, Oxford. He specializes in Pakistan's ethnic, constitutional, electoral, sectarian, military, and militant politics, and his books include Politics in the State in Pakistan, the 1993 elections in Pakistan, Strengthening of Democracy in Pakistan, and Democratization in Pakistan, a study of the 2002 elections. He has also edited the book Electoral Reform in Pakistan. But the focus of today's talk is his latest book, which I would call his magnum opus, which is Political Conflict in Pakistan. And I just want to add a little thing to this bio and say that he is for sure one of my earliest mentors. So I am coming to this conversation as somebody who has been following Professor Waseem's work for over the past 2 decades, and it gives me great pleasure today to have him here and to join us for this wonderful talk. Insofar as the book is concerned, I will just say a very few words about it, and then over to you, Professor Waseem, for sort of refining and elaborating on those themes, and also please correcting me where you think that my interpretation may be off, because this is a very rich, complex piece of work, not for the faint-hearted researchers, but there is a lot in there for a wide number of audiences, and I will say more on that later. So the first thing, of course, the title tells you that this is a book which is focused on political conflict in Pakistan, right? So that is the overarching theme, and within that theme, Professor Waseem has a few really important premises or points of departure, jise hum kahenge, which make it stand out from the existing literature on the subject, right? So one of these is that conflict in a post-colonial state like Pakistan is endemic. So there's a systemicity to this conflict, right? You can't compartmentalize it. It's part of a bigger problem or a part of a bigger trajectory that we'll just reflect upon. So he claims that conflict is a byproduct of the state building project. It's endemic in post-colonial societies such as Pakistan. He also claims that the state is the key factor in the emergence of this conflict, and that the institutional design of the state is a very important, if not primary, determinant of the nature and scope of conflict. And finally, he says that this conflict in Pakistan is a source of a permanent crisis of governance in a post-colonial state, and I have to say that that is a bit of a bleak note, and we will invite you to say a bit more about why you would characterize it as permanent. Would there ever be a way out of this? But so broadly, I just want you to say a few words about why are these premises of your work significant in terms of the literature that exists on the theme of political conflict, and then say a bit more about why you think this conflict is permanent. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. You rightly focused on the word conflict and its systemicity, and therefore, let me talk more about it. Why did I write about political conflict? Of course, there are various other conflicts and crises, but political conflict is essentially related to public life, number one. Number two, it situates you in a situation where you are unhappy with your surroundings, economic, political, and other. You are not settled. And that's why you are constantly talking, for example, amongst the colleagues and friends, and of course, youngsters and the elderly, whoever, that there's something wrong with the country. So this country is doomed. This is usually the case. For example, in India, long ago when I landed there, and I was in a queue for buying the ticket or something, and they started quarreling with each other, and everybody was talking about India. Suddenly you collectivize the image. India is doomed to failure if this kind of behavior continues. The same we do here, and the same in very many third world countries. So there have been data collected about happiness or unhappiness of the people with the system. And of course, with us is less usual, but in various countries, for example, they say that in France, people are not as happy as in England with the system. And then they try to explain why there is a larger gap between the ambition and the reality in France, whereas there is more of legal socialization in England, where abiding by the laws, settling down, not expecting too much out of, for example, democracy, and, for example, by way of driving, the way they do is much more constrained and careful than the country across the channel, and so many other things. So this has been gauged with reference to various variables, but here we are talking about the conflict in Pakistan. Why there is so much of instability, and there, first of all, I raise the question how to study it. Is it a unique country? All the time talking about Pakistan being crisis-ridden. Most of our references are to the country itself. We generally tend not to situate this country in a larger group of countries. That is the uniqueness, and probably in every country you are more local than global, and your worries and your references are recognized with reference to your own nation and so on. So here, Why is there so much conflict? The first thing is that conflict is always there in almost every country, every society, every tribe, every peasant society, for example, every village in America, England, France, Germany. Why is there conflict or mega conflict not part of their imagination? They feel that their systems are functioning. And there is a feeling here that the system is not functioning. In other words, and that's my first point, that Pakistan lacks a conflict resolution mechanism. And so do 77 other post-colonial states. And in every country of this particular category, you will hear the same thing. There is no conflict resolution mechanism. During the last 300 or 400 years in the West, what they did was, while coping with the conflict, try to involve the public in such a way that they'll be possible to move towards some kind of resolution. For example, disengage the public from the street. Ask them to send their representatives to a forum. That's called parliament. And there then will try to empower it by way of lawmaking so that the public representatives, that means both the public in it and the state authority, in other words, the meeting point of the state and the society, there then we talk about how to resolve the conflict. And similarly, one after the other, first in the Anglo-American sort of setting, then the continent, the European continent, those countries, and so on, they were able to establish these mechanisms. That's the historical West and whatever. On the other hand, again, in Bahrain and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, these countries have their conflict resolution mechanisms. Have you ever heard about the way public comes out, for example, in Pakistan, to demonstrate against a state, against a policy, against an international issue? No. Even against Israeli bombardment over Palestinians, there was hardly any demonstrations. In the Gulf countries, those Arab countries which were or have been directly hit in so many ways by Israel, because there is no public. The public is denied a role where they would be talking, for example, to the state eye to eye. They're as good Muslims as we are, and whatever. But on the religious issues, there'll be a kind of a different show of resentment. Why? Because there is and has been a traditional machinery of the state which has never opened to participation of the society. Now, these are the models. The historical West was able to do that, but among the Muslim countries, two types. One, where there was no colonial rule, like I've just talked about, the Gulf countries. On the other hand, there was colonization for 1 to 2 to 300 years or more, where the institutions and laws of Europe were transplanted into colonial societies thousands of miles away from Germany, France, Italy, England, and so on. And these countries were ruled by people directly coming from those countries, and the laws and institutions were brought and they developed here in their own ways, not exactly like the original model, but still. And we have to understand that there was and is right now in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, at least in South Asia, but elsewhere as well, there is the metropolitan language, which is the language of the state, language of the administration, language of the constitution. Imagine 1 to 2% of the public operating in English and 98% of the public in a way alienated from the idiom which is used, the understanding of the wording itself, that's cut off from the public. Public has to therefore get interpreters, and that's how most of our leaders were the lawyers themselves. Nehru, Gandhi, Jinnah, and so on. They were the interpreters of the public to the state, and they were interpreters of the state to the public. And that's how they were able to link the two units which were not directly linked. And that's how conflict continued, but it took a different shape. What was that? Once that public matured in a way, or their leadership, for example, in India, then they started knocking at the door of the state. They wanted their share. They wanted this state to belong to them. So for 100 years, the state was very much put in place, established by the British, for example, British India, but then we wanted it back. We did not want to dismantle the state. No, we wanted to keep it. Only we wanted to own it. It was such a powerful state. Never before in history there has been such a powerful state. State as a structure of power, because states were usually rulerships. They were powers in the sense that they could kill, they could control. So modern state, particularly flowing from Britain, that is Europe, in a larger sense, they structured that power on a permanent basis in terms of institutions. That's how from Prussia the British brought bureaucracy, civil bureaucracy, and similarly Germany and other countries, wherever the model was. Napoleonic warfare, for example, is the first lesson in our NDC and NDU and so on, meaning thereby the collective experience of the West. That was brought in. Now we have a modern state and a traditional society. Algeria, Ghana, Tanzania, Uganda, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, go to any corner of the world, and you have post-colonial states. To push the colonials out, what did we do? Gandhi, after doing bar at in London, and Nehru and others, they could not push the colonial state. How to do that? They went to the society. Gandhi, the so-called half-naked fakir, others, they started talking to the public through their idiom, made them ready for making administration impossible for the colonial state, gradually hitting it hard and hard, absorbing the traditional culture of the society, making them aware of something called nationalism and so on. Nationalism, by the way, is a direct importation from the West, never before. So this is how this leadership was able to push and capture the modern state. And in the process, while the state was modern, nationalism was culture-based, religion-based, tradition-based, which hit the modern state. After 47, India and Pakistan, we have been absorbing tradition. Tradition has been hitting it has been putting pressure on the modern state, and that's how Islamization of Pakistan, that's how now Hindutva in India, and in a similar way, this nationalism, which is tradition, carrying all the idiom and whatever, this, instead of being a modern input, it is a traditional input. That means nationalism and state in post-colonial societies are colliding with each other. So I don't want to, in a way, polarize the two units, society and the state or whatever, because there is quite a bit of modernity in the society now and quite a bit of tradition in the state itself. But there is that particular gap which isn't there in the Gulf countries or whatever, which isn't there in the West. But here, 77, 80 countries of the post-colonial states, they are the ones where conflict is systemic.
Brilliant. So this is a really fantastic segue into the next segment of the discussion, because Professor Waseem also, after this introduction in his book, begins with the subject of partition. And the reason why partition is important is because it brings to head the clashes and the contradictions that he's talking about in nationalist movements, movements for independence in the colonial world, and how that clash between the modern and the traditional comes to be hardwired into this entire process of decolonization. So Professor Waseem refers to partition as the blueprint for the conflict that then we see kind of, sort of evolving over time. But partition is where, in a sense, it's the genesis of the story. Of course, there's a long colonial trajectory which he's explained. But when we come to partition, he argues that it is the institutional design of partition which becomes a major determinant of conflict in Pakistan. And it basically creates the pathway to an exclusive reliance on religion. And that process is intermingled with the rise of the middle class, which he will explain, which then ascends to the top of the state machinery. And then, of course, there are so many other aspects and dimensions of partition, right? And they involve migration, patterns of refugee resettlement, and how those refugees interact with the so-called natives or native populations, the whole process of construction of class, ethnic imbalance, and also the creation of what he refers to as an insider and outsider dynamic in Pakistan. Now that's a lot to take in, but let's just have a general conversation about why partition is important to conflict.
Let's start with the understanding of partition. For example, we were taught in the school books and college textbooks and whatever, that of course we were two nations. That's how the two nation theory. And I've tried to get into argument with, for example, Ayat Qureshi, who talks about the two nations, that we in India lived as two nations for 500 years. We were never friendly with each other. We were living side by side. And that's why this conflict is absolutely natural. Finally, we got Pakistan out of it. So this was a new reading of Indian history based on conflict. This was the minority response to the emerging Indian nationalism. Because then we tried to belong to it, but we couldn't, and that's why. What was the history? It was all conflict. That's number one. We were separate. Actually, that is absolutely wrong. So my little contribution here is that I tried to trace it through various scholarly works and whatever, that there was a kind of a intermingling of faiths for hundreds of years. People got converted, and today, for example, in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, nearly 90% of the people who are Muslim, they are like Hindu or Sikh converted Muslims. That's how it is. And they were getting converted, and there is the approach which we call accretion, which means you add up gods and goddesses. And that's what was happening. For example, Abdul Rahman Siddiqui or Muhammad Abdullah or various other characters which I talk about in the book, they were there and they would start with praise to Allah, and then they talked about various other deities from before conversion. And that's how there was this intermingling of faiths. So, for example, I've quoted the Sikhs, 90,000 Sikhs attending Sakhi Sarwar saints in 1 year, and 200,000 people who registered themselves as Hindu Mohammedans. But the identities were mingled. And this was not there, that there was one nation against the other or whatever, because even Aurangzeb, apart from Jahangir and Shah Jahan and whoever, and Chand Bibi, and they had their generals and soldiers and Hindus and Sikhs. And so there was a kind of a society where you belonged to various faiths and creeds, but there was a kind of warfare going on all the time, where territorially based kings and queens fought with other territorially based kings and queens, whichever religion they belonged to. That was the pattern for 500 long years. There was no reform movement among the Muslims, for example, making them good Muslims or whatever. There was Bhakti Tahreek, and that was all. Meaning thereby that there wasn't 500, 600, 700 years conflict at all. And that happened when the British dominated, fully conquered the subcontinent. There were directly ruled states, indirectly ruled states, and that's how there were now incidents where there were carnivals, there were other kinds of religious festivals, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh. That's at that time when, for example, Musaddas-e-Hali was written. That's the last quarter of 19th century. Singh Sabha was made last quarter of the 19th century. And that was when Arya Samaj, sometimes people call it as an extremist Hindu party or whatever. These were the so-called religious renaissances in the three religions. Within 3/4 of a century, that is by mid-20th century, these communities had gone ahead with so much of identity formation that they were separate entities, and by that time, Muslim elite was mature enough not to accept the diktat of the Hindu elite, whereby Sikh elite was on the sides continuously doing whatever it could do from Ghadar Party onwards, 1918, whatever. That's the partition. Partition has a history of 75 years of political mobilization. And they grew apart. More and more of Islamization, more and more of Hinduization and Sikh identity. That's how religion became an actor instead of region. And that is how we ended up in partition. And here then, this the partition led to formation of Pakistan. Here was Pakistan. Who led Pakistan? None. Pakistan idea, and that's how I would refer you to the book Muslim Zion. That's a book by Faisal Devji. He is a professor in St. Antony's College, Oxford. It's a wonderful book. The Muslim Zion, there was the Muslim elite, and where was the Muslim elite? Which was struggling for Pakistan, or which was fighting for Muslim rights, but they were the most established part of the Muslim elite. That was in UP and other Muslim minority provinces such as Bombay, such as Bengal at that time, and Bihar, of course, Muslim minority. We were all these, for example, today's Pakistani area, their Muslims were underdeveloped. 19% in jobs in Punjab, while they were 56% in population. That was the Punjab scene. It was much worse for Muslims in Sindh. In other words, they were not in a position to lead a movement. There wasn't any consciousness about it. That's how UP Muslims, they were only 14%, but they had 44% of jobs. They were 44% in higher education. They considered themselves the legatees of the Mughal dynasty, and before that, 500 or 600 years. They had dominated India for hundreds of years. Who? The UP Muslims. Among them, who? There was a kind of division, Ashraf and Ajlaf. Ashraf, those who come from non-Indian stock. That's how Sayyid, that's how Hashmi, Qureshi, Naqvi, Rizvi, you hear all that. Others, particularly in Punjab, for example, the castes were not changed after conversion, so you still have Tarar and Chima and Chata and others from before conversion. They are there very much. So those Ashraf, they called others Ajlaf. Not a single person belonging to Indian origin ever ruled India in 700 years. Only Muslims of non-Indian origins could rule. That was the point at that partition. These people from UP came to rule Pakistan. From Bombay, Jinnah Sahib came to rule Pakistan. That is how Muslim Zion. They planned for Pakistan sitting in UP in an area which was peripheral to British India. They were sitting at the heart of British India, and they were planning for Northeast India, Bengal, and Northwest. That was the beginning. This is partition. That's why after partition there was a kind of a new ethnic hierarchy. On top, Urdu speaking migrants. Then Bombayites, the businessmen. Then East Punjabis, those, they were more in services. Here there was the landed elite, but in East Punjab there was quite a bit of educated Muslim elite. Chaudhry Muhammad Ali, for example, and others. He was the first Secretary General of Pakistan, and whatever. This is the post-partition ethnic hierarchy. Punjab was converted to Pakistan cause as late as 1946. From 1923 to 1946, 47, who was the ruler? Unionist Party. Against Muslim League. Muslim League never ruled Punjab. And whereas in 1939, all the Muslim minority provinces had voted for Muslim League. So they were 10 years ahead of majority provinces. That's why when the new elite came, the migrant elite, it distrusted the locals. Their legitimacy was looked down upon. Here was Bacha Khan, straight away dismissed within the week. And Surawardi, no more chief minister, it was Nazimuddin. And here again, in these areas, one after the other, Khodo was dismissed, Punjab government, a new patch-up was installed, and so on. Here was the top leadership which enjoyed maximum legitimacy. Then East Punjabi, so migrant was on top. In a study, a PhD thesis, there it was that 3% Urdu-speaking migrants in Pakistan in 1960s, there were 3%. In Pakistan Foreign Service alone, there were 55%. and of course ministries. And the Prime Minister was a migrant, and Governor General Ali Azam, a migrant from Bombay. They were migrants. So I have here mentioned as my little contribution that this is a migrant state. Its priorities were set by migrants, and they came particularly from East Punjab. They swam through a river of blood, and that turned them against Hindus so much that they are not ready to accept the reality even today. So this is the framework. Partition set the new sets of polarization. Hindu Muslim, never. Anti-Westernism, always. They were the recent imperialists. How could we go along with them? So Islam versus the West, Muslims versus the Hindus. There was a mini clash of civilizations that started, and we are all shaped and made by the media following that particular political message. So here, I think I'll stop here so that we can move ahead. Yes.
Brilliant. So on the note of a mini clash of civilizations, the question that arises is, this is of course the clash that you're referring to is broadly in terms of, let's say, the state and the society at large, right? But then there is also the state itself, which you describe as not only a key factor in kind of determining conflict and trajectories of conflict, but that the state itself is also in conflict with different segments of itself, right?
Yes.
And typically, that conflict is described in terms of institutional conflict. This such and such state institution is in conflict with another state institution. But what Professor Waseem does is to take what I would refer to as a law and society approach to the notion of the state, which is to say, we don't just look at the state in terms of institutional segmentation, we look at it in terms of the sociology of elite formation. Who are the people who are peopling the state? And what is the conflict going on at that level of social relations that constitute the state itself? So he talks, and this is really a running theme through his work, which is to say that Pakistan today has two competing power centers. One is the middle class, something which has become really, really significant and ubiquitous after the Imran Khan phenomenon, for sure. And the other is the political class. And both these classes are in a tug of war with each other. They draw on different historical trajectories. And the class which is most definitely in power or holds more power is the middle class, because it is in alliance with the military, which is the power holder in the country, and they dictate and determine and shape what he refers to as the master narrative, which is also steeped in conflict, and he'll talk more about that. And interestingly, all this then leads Professor Waseem to refer to Pakistan as an establishmentarian democracy, where there is an establishment, it is a cohort of middle classes that shapes what we refer to as our political system, whether you want to call it a democracy or not. And he says, we need to distinguish this concept from the hybrid regime term, which is a label which is now being used more commonly for Pakistan. So he refers it to an establishmentarian democracy because he's trying to explain this conflict in the context of how these different classes are in competition with each other. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I think I'll have to do a bit of leapfrogging. There's quite a bit to cover, but I'll try. First of all, as I said, we are born into conflict. One, the narrative. Narrative is extremely important because it shapes our attitude. It makes our opinions. Narrative. Edward Said, for example, I've quoted him, that nations are narrations. How do they narrate themselves and others? So, for example, I've put one section, construction of the Hindu demon. We constructed a Hindu demon, a devil out there. Our textbooks, and I've quoted quite a few. And the devil, which is the West. Why are we so much held by the West? Because we are a small fry in a world which is dominated by the West. This is in the age of globalization. Actually, it is the age where West dominates the globe, and it has dominated the globe for the last 500 to 600 years. Now it is not directly, that means in a territorial sense, controlling those societies individually, but the system of world capitalism, it controls the world strategy, naval, ground forces, others. The power on the ground belongs to the West. So there is, in almost every third world country, anti-Westernism. That is the reason that we need to hate the domineering power. The West is a clear example. So Colombia and Venezuela and Brazil and Argentina and India and Pakistan and Sri Lanka, what do they share with each other? Thousands of miles away, anti-Westernism. Because they are the ones out there. They are the masters of the globe. So in that sense, when the country became independent, there were two power holders, or the two power centers. One, the feudal elite. They were there for thousands of years. Zamindars, they were called. The British came. How do you rule? They said, okay, the local power holders. They collaborated with them and ruled India. This is called, in literature, collaborative mechanism. The tribal chiefs, for example, in South Africa, whole of it, there are important tribal chiefs. The British ruled through them in Nigeria and Ghana and various other African countries. How did you rule? Through the tribal chiefs. How did they rule Balochistan? Through the tribal chiefs. And KP? Through the tribal chiefs. And the landed elite in India, and including the cis-Indus provinces of Punjab and Sindh, peasant societies, the trans-Indus provinces, Balochistan and KP, tribal, they got collaborators who then turned into legislators when constitutional reforms were introduced. They were the ones who got elected into the provincial assemblies, who elected the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan. They are the ones, 80 of them, that was the assembly. It was called Constituent Assembly. They were formally our rulers through collaborative mechanism, legislation, etc. But that elite, they came to power, they got elected, for example, from 37 to 47, 10 years. The bureaucrats, they were recruited through an examination as early as 1854. And onwards, for 90 years, the British, but then Indians, Hindus and Muslims, they were recruited into the services. These were the people, the DCs, the commissioners, the secretaries. They had a 100-year-old experience of operating and ruling the country. They were the real rulers, and they are the real rulers after 80 years. They know what is the law, they know what is the scope of administration, how to control the police, the others. The canopy of politicians represented, they came and they started ruling as if in their own name. And the middle class, which was the services, the bureaucracy, and gradually now even the army officer, earlier they were the rural people, now it is the middle class. They were born as powerful elite, ruling elite. Middle class is ultimately the ruling elite of Pakistan. It shapes the narrative. It is the most institutionalized state platform. That means military, bureaucracy, and the judiciary. Now the society is out there. Society therefore tries to get into the state through its representatives. That's politician. That's the political class. Political class is out. The young boy, my students go into the services at the age of 25, 26, 27, 28. And they are there for 35 years. These people, 5 years, they get elected. They don't have feet on the ground. They come, they can be thrown out, whatever. They're not part of the state. They are constantly trying to get into the state. So there is a basic difference between the two. When they come into power, so-called into office, that's why both these elites can collide. So here, probably 5 more minutes. So these are the two classes which are in constant clash in Pakistan, in India, in Sri Lanka, in other South Asian countries. The establishment was, in a way, part of the rulership. But why was it different here? Why is establishment here different from the political establishment, this real establishment, state establishment? Why? Because in India, Nehru for 17 years and otherwise, it was subsumed by the establishment. It was inside. It was caste-based. Caste-based. Congress was in place for 20, 30 years, electorally speaking. Muslim League was nowhere in Pakistan area, particularly in Punjab, when the country was born. So there was a political elite which was extremely weak, immature, not penetrative enough into the system, and that's why it depended on the bureaucracy. So for 4 years there was Liaquat Ali Khan as Prime Minister. Forget it. Who was the real Prime Minister? Chaudhry Muhammad Ali. For 4 years he was Secretary General of Bureaucracy. He was the real ruler. And what happened usually was that there was a cabinet meeting, forget it. Then there was the secretaries meeting out there. They took the decision and they took to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister stamped it, and that was it. This was the assembly. This was the democracy. So because what the British gave us, the most positive thing, that rule by constitution. And constitution says there would be rule by public representatives. That's why for 70 years the state apparatus is suffering from this particular input by the British. That is, that Pakistan will be ruled by public representatives and there will be constitutional rule. So whoever, whenever they tried to hit it, for example, under Ziaul Haq, there was Bhutto out there, how to rip him off of this particular constitutional source of legitimacy, because he was extremely afraid. You hold election, Bhutto will come into power. So to counter the constitutional source of legitimacy, you had to bring in a divine source of legitimacy, Islamization. And you took it seriously enough to go as far as it could, and that's why new narrative, new Islamization, cultural battles started emerging because there was this mission mental state trying to change the culture of the new society. On the other hand, for thousands of years, there was this Hindi society, Punjabi society, Bengali society, Belo society, their culture. So there were two cultures, high culture, low culture, land and the public. Essentially, that was the basic culture, and on top there was Islamic culture. That was a new term, it was a new kind of coordination, and that's how the two have continued to be in conflict with each other. And finally, the last word, establishmentarian democracy. What do I mean? That this particular center of the state, powerhouse of the state, what the middle class as opposed to the politicians who belong to the collaborators, the British collaborators. The middle class was the very product of the British. They educate those who went to schools and colleges, got into services. They were trained by the British. British state, by the way, colonial India, 85% of British Indian state comprised of middle class. Itself, it had the ideals of middle class, all the colonial states. So they were the ones who, when the British left, whom did they give the power? To the Pakistan middle class, which was getting into services or was already in services. So here, this establishment managed to get a foothold outside the assembly. And the establishment has been hitting the parliament whenever it could. Now come election, every now and then establishment had the power to influence electables, parties, banning parties sometimes under military rule, which was, what was the military rule in Pakistan? Actually bureaucratic rule, meaning that the elected ministers are responsible to the society. The military government is not. Constitutionally speaking, it is an unconstitutional setup. That's why 2018 election, Project Imran #1, we have to bring PTI in, we have to bring PTI at every cost. Get rid of the elected establishment, we have to bring it in. 2024 election, Project Imran #2, stop him from coming to power. Stop him from coming to power. He cannot come. Both these elections represent what? Establishmentarian democracy. The goals of the establishment you have to get through establishment. So establishment wants this, you go that way. Otherwise, so these politicians and political parties become pawns in the hands of the permanent power holder in Pakistan. Thank you very much.
And talking about the constitution then, given this complicated conflict which has come to be inbuilt in the system, what does constitutionalism really mean then in Pakistan, right? And Professor Waseem argues that it's both an independent and a dependent variable vis-a-vis power dynamics. What does he mean by that? He means that it constitutes the power struggle, but it's also constituted by the power struggle. So you can't dismiss it in the sense that it remains a formal framework of political legitimacy that even the establishment tries, at least in some formal way, to comply with. But of course, there are a lot of machinations and engineering to try and also go around it or against it. So he speaks of the huge gap between the design of constitutionalism and what the actual practice of constitutionalism is. And that, of course, shapes and generates its own further conflict, right? And he speaks in this regard of three areas of power struggle. One is parliamentary sovereignty, one is federalism, and the third is Islamism. The three core, I think, subjects of contestation that go way back to the first decade as well. So I would invite you to elaborate on that, and if you want to then weave into that the role of the judiciary in the mass public, you're welcome to, or we can leave that for the Q&A. Thank you.
Just for the sake of more time, so that I can address any questions if there are any. I would simply manage to cover the first part, and that is that constitutionalism is a great shaper and maker of the narrative in Pakistan. ये गैर आइनी है, ये गैर कानूनी है, ये all the time you hear it from the opposition. It seeks refuge in the protective umbrella of Constitution. Constitution, imagine saying there will be no discrimination against on the basis of gender, caste, creed, whatever. There is all the discrimination in the society against women, against caste, on the basis of caste, and whatever. So, here is Constitution which is much more progressive than the practice. Institutional design is more progressive. It was brought at a time from Europe, from the West, when they had gone ahead in terms of movement from class in itself to class for itself. Trade unionism was very much advanced. People were extremely conscious about their rights. There was some kind of entitled citizenry already in place. That's why they demanded representation in the state. Then came women out in 1928. They got finally the right to vote as late as that. But all that struggle which went into this, that shaped that constitution which they brought here, whereas the society was far less into it. It was not demanding those particular rights for those sections of society which were not in the forefront of the struggle for independence. But that is how Constitution is a constant irritant in the power dynamics of Pakistan. Because all the have-nots are talking about the Constitution. Look, this is the Constitution, this is what it says. Because the Constitution was not made by the society. It was brought in with higher ideals 100 or 200 years before the society reached that particular level of struggle. On the other hand, when the powerful come to power, they start constitutional engineering. First, presidential system. No, this parliamentarism wouldn't do. That was totally dictatorial because there is a history of 100 years of parliamentarism. You don't suddenly push the button and become something else. Most of the Latin American countries are presidential in their constitutional framework. Why? Because there were military type independence struggles where there was George Washington became president. Others in other Latin American countries, there were on the horseback, there was the independence fighter. In these countries, in the British colonial system, there were baby steps towards more power and then more power. And from 1909, 1919, 1939, 35 India Act, and then 1947, and even before that, local bodies elections in 1880s. That's how people got used to getting their representatives out there. And not through the armed struggle, not on the horseback. That was the kind of constitutional awareness that we were born with. That's why those military officers who went to America and saw the presidential system working there, why not Pakistan be a presidential system? There should be concentration of authority on top, the military thinking, the bureaucracy thinking, where they feel that there should be a pyramid of authority and on top there should be somebody. It doesn't happen that way. There is a historical tradition and that has to be taken into consideration. That's why in England constantly they're talking, look at the American system, how wonderful, one president out there. In America they're constantly talking about the British system. This masterly hand which president uses here, look at the collective rulership in England. So they miss each other. You know, they miss each other out. They find the grass greener on the other side. Otherwise, there was no reason why President Ayub or anybody else would have changed the system from one to the other. Therefore, it was totally rejected in 1969, but military is still there, establishment is still there. Therefore, they tried whenever they could to put 58 to be and thereby make it semi-presidential. So this is the kind of parliament or rather constitution that we have. That is semi-presidential here and there, and then the civilians come to power and they remove the 58 to be, and then let's see what happens next. But the establishment has discovered more ways of manipulating the working of the state from outside. That's why I thought that this is the term that can be used, establishmentarian.
Thank you so much. Let's have a round of applause for Professor Waseem. It's a very engaging discussion. We could have gone on for a few hours, but we're going to stop now. And over to the audience now for questions and answers, please.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम सर, वजाहत अली, स्टूडेंट हूँ मैं इंटरनेशनल रिलेशंस का, और मैं खुद अपनी बुक भी लिख रहा हूँ, एमफिल का थीसिस है. जैसे आई वांट टू नो, एज यू सेड दैट नेशंस आर द नरेशंस दैट हाउ दे नरेट ईच अदर. So is it Pakistan is a failing nation, or it can be a successful nation, that how we are narrating ourselves in the world, we are not yet successful?
Actually, what I meant was, what kind of narrative did we develop in 70 years? So there we have been narrating ourselves, and there are wonderful examples. Pakistan, or rather Islamic world, has produced scholars with a level much higher than Aristotle, Plato. These were the claims. Every post-colonial society has its own claims. It's recently freed, and therefore it has high ambitions. It sees the world in its own glorious ways. That's why they invent, first of all, a glorious past. We were there. Okay, today we are down. That doesn't mean that we were always like that. We were up there. We dominated the civilization. India now discovering and constantly talking about 200 years back, Ashoka and Chandragupta Maurya, and of course other heroes. So they are digging up. So the post-colonial states dig up the past. That's very much rampant, this particular narration. And second is, of course, that you are born with an other. We were born with India, the other, the Hindu, and of course the West, and remotely, but still very much part of our otherization, which is Israel. So Israel being the symbol of Jews, therefore we tend to hate Jews altogether, not Israelis, not only the country, but Jews wherever they happen to be. That's why from British Indian days onwards, if you remember, in Bombay there was this play, Yahudi ki ladki. Yahudi means what Merchant of Venice meant. Remember? So even among the Christians, for 2,000 years they hated the Jews for hanging Christ, and therefore they had as much hatred about Jews as we had. So this is part of the narrative, and we will be one day great, and will be as dominant. So this we have been saying for the last 70 years. India. So India is the largest pit of poverty in the world. Even today, after 8% growth or whatever, but talk to Indians, their narration is different. The great Indian civilization. So it's only narration, that's the self-image.
Dr. The establishment of Deoband and the Barelvi school and their sort of progression into Pakistan, and what shape the schools have taken as almost becoming more than schools of thought, almost क्या कहते हैं उसको फिका के लेवल पे खुदा नखास्त ऑलमोस्ट
Schools of
जाने
thought,
हैं.
yes.
So वो उसको भी अगर आप थोड़ा ये मिडिल क्लास स्टोरी में फिट करें तो that would be very nice.
The political class and the middle class. Political class is usually, it was at least till recently, based in the rural sector, because only 15% people lived in urban centers when Pakistan came into being. 80 to 85% lived in the rural sector, and there the landed elite got elected in state assemblies, and they were usually interested in, and they usually belong to Bravery school of thought, including the Sufi, the shrine-based people. On the other hand, the urbanites, particularly the middle class, tended to go for the written code of Islam. So there was shrine-based Islam and the madrasa-based Islam. Shrine-based, that was bravery, not in every sense and in every case, but typically. And the so-called modern elite, urban middle class, it tended to follow Deobandi school of thought, but not in a religious sense. I mean, not in a ritualistic sense, because Pakistan was got by whom? By the most westernized section of the Muslim population. Here was religion which was used in lieu of consensus in the society. There wasn't any. The Muslims from Bombay and Calcutta and UP and Punjab and Sindh and Balochistan, they didn't think in the same way, culturally, religiously, or in ritualistic sense. Therefore, because that kind of civilizational metaphor didn't exist for Muslims, they belonged to various pockets throughout the subcontinent. Therefore, there was a kind of over-reliance on ideological factor. But who was relying on ideological factor? Not particularly the religious people. I mean, today it is very uncommon for public figures marrying non-Muslims. Imran Khan, Jemima, which that particular episode didn't worry people so much, because Western women, yes, it's not Christian or it's not something, it's a Western. Otherwise, Raja Azam marrying a Parsi woman and Liaquat Ali marrying a Hindu woman, that will not be today an accepted fact. You come to a power, then it will be a kind of a liability or something. Because there has been now Islamization for the last 70 years or so. At that time, there was quite a bit of sort of liberal atmosphere. So that was the elite which made Pakistan. And that's why from day one, they struggled with the religious people. Religious people wanted, oh, you promised Sharia, where is that? And they said, okay, yes, we will bring to 1953, 1952, the first the objective resolution, then the 1952 report, then the 1956 constitution, then 1962 constitution. Each time the modernist elite got away, and by simply giving promises to the religious elite, and they said sovereignty belongs to us. So yes, why not? Yes, sovereignty belongs to Allah. Whatever. So the symbolic accommodation of the religious elite, that has been the official policy of the modernist elite in Pakistan. And that's how Brailwi or Deobandi, that is rather deep into the society and mainly ritualistic. Only after Ziaul Haq came to power, then there was a Deobandi-led Sunni Islamization, while in Iran, Shia-led Islamization was going on. So that's why there was quite a bit of reliance of the Zia regime on Sipahi Sahaba Pakistan, for example. There were two ministers in Punjab at that time. They were known to be pro that party and so on. So these non-state actors were in the hands of the state whenever there was needed some kind of a, what is it called, Islamic touch? Religious input. So that's how they relied on them, etc. I'll stop there. Yeah. Acha.
I can appreciate that I have never seen such a writing which explains how the unity and opposite of modern state structures and the traditional.
Thank you, sir.
You have defined it two categories. You say this is not traditional, this is modern, and as well traditional. And there has been in sociology this was a big problem of modernity and traditional conflict we see in the Western writings on sociology. There are some very brilliant lines by you, which needed at least quite big chapters. Like, for example, you say Pakistan got out of India, but India lives in Pakistan. Then you say bypassing and referring to some Bengali authors quite significantly. You say that this communal conflict and resolution of communal conflict was not the end of communal conflict in 1947. And in later decades, it is coming in India. आजकल कह रहे हैं कि राम लहर है और राम राज्य और वो कह रहे हैं कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन. मैं जो आप तो उसमें some very brilliant lines and theses in your books वो आप फैला गए हैं क्योंकि you are very clear in your head, but I think those issues deserve more. Most brilliant part of your book is which you are discussing in the formation period of two-nation theory and the dialogues. In fact, I came to understand and know many of the writers you have referred to. I heard them, I read them, lekin you have put it together. My question is whether 47 was the reversal of modernity, because colonial period, if we follow your argument, you are saying the state is modernist and progressive, and society is reactionary because it is traditional. I have another point here, that Islam, your Muslimness is based on alienation from your culture. In India, Muslims thought that we have come from outside, and this is a police society, and they distance themselves from the local culture and tradition, which we call the Hindu demon. ये जो हमारे यहाँ नेशन स्टेट बिल्डिंग भी हुई, उसमें हमने ट्रेडिशन को बेस नहीं बनाया, because you are taking tradition in terms of ideological two-nation theory or Islam or whatever, in terms of religion. Nation state was built on the grave of the traditional historical cultures and nationalities and people who lived here for thousands of years. हम कहते नहीं, हम तो हमारी तारीख शुरू होती है when first Muslim came to India, and our Muslimness is in conflict with our historical roots. So we cannot build a terrestrial state, a nation state, on the basis of our cultural roots, and we try to build a state which doesn't recognize the nation state itself or its geographical entity. Perhaps that part is missing, because our nation building is in conflict with the people of Pakistan who live here. And if that is traditional, I will call that traditional. That is progressive, rather, part of it. And these were people who fought for democracy in this country.
Can we, sorry.
Yes.
Yes, please go.
Ji, thank you very much for the opportunity. Before this, I was just thinking and relating to this episode that I picked the mic, but it was taken away from me, that maybe we take discipline very casually and the moderator should intervene. But thank you very much, you intervened. Professor, thank you for such a wonderful discourse. As you have chalked out many players and variables in this historical, even connecting the political conflict of Pakistan, uh, there are 3 points which I want to ask you. First, you showed some sort of a romance with British English, talking about the moral code and mode of governance. But when we look at, for example, Sashi Tharoor and William Dunkley, who introduced in his book Loot, he puts a very different picture about English as amorals, number one. Number two, when they came and visited, the British took over the whole world, what is your perspective, especially in terms of advancement of weapons? Because, what I can see, the bullet and the rifle played a very important role in terms of political... Bullet and the rifle. The difference between weaponry, which was available with the Mughals versus the bullet and the rifle and the dynamite that was available with the English. There was no parallel in terms of when you are at war. So how you see that shaping up? And most importantly, the most modern question which I want to ask now, what we are seeing is that the industrial and commercial elite of India played a very vital role, offering their treasuries, offering their assets to the Qaid and so on. So what now we see is that enterprise spirit, that entrepreneurial spirit has almost died down today. And what we are seeing is the overall rent-seeking capture that's taking over. So is it going to be sustainable? Because at the end of the day, it's the money that makes the mayor go.
Let's move on. Thank you. Deep.
Okay, I'll rise to it. Pakistan got out of India in 1947, but India did not get out of Pakistan. That's what I have written in my book. And then I explain that ever since independence, we have been trying to de-Indianize ourselves through this Indian thing. Basant, Hindu. The wedding ceremonies, rituals, Mehndi, Hindu. Other things, they're Hindu. Medicine, I know we are all into using Ayurvedic medicine or whatever, जो शानदार सबसे ज़्यादा है. And so much, we try to invent something Pakistani. Our Veda, Sawan, Bhado, for hundreds of years it was Indian, Hindu. Our days, the names of days, Somvar, Somnath, Somras, Hindu, Mangal Devta, Mangal, Mahatma Buddha, Buddha, Aditya War, Atwar, Itwar, Sun God. We operate in it and we don't know. We are not even conscious how much India is there in us. So we try and we continue to try during the last 70 years to take out India out of us. And therefore, Indian history is not our history. So our generation, we were school children, and at that time there was the Hindu period, then the British period, Muslim period, then the British period, no more. Now you start with 47 as if Pakistan got from heavens like a bolt in 1947, no history beyond, and that's why I've talked about it, the crisis of historical consciousness. That is there. We are the people without history, and so on. The modernity reversal, you said it, I've explained it. There is a very complex process here. The modern elite is modernizing itself, and that's why there are millions more graduates, and there are dozens, and in fact hundreds of more educational institutions tending to serve the modern elite, and they are self-serving in some ways. So they are producing the modern elite. My institution is one, and there are others. This is. At the other end, they have to take the society along with them. Quaid-e-Azam had to take the society with him. How to? Islam. Okay, the modern elite has to give the Islamic touch. That's what they are doing even today. Meaning what? That the society is the way it is. The society is also modernizing. Deep down into the lower classes, there is the use of now mobile, and because of that, social media, and that's how there is political consciousness which is going deep there. But this is exactly what I have talked about in the class. There is the modernity crisis. We were moving in a certain direction, so looking at the West, look how developed they are. But at the same time, India is like an oil rig going deep into 2000 years, Chandragupta Maurya, our ancient civilization. So they are digging up ideological frameworks from the past and thereby defining their nationalism that way. So there is quite a contradictory sort of process going on. But again, our constitutional role, particularly in the framework of Islamization, and there I have talked about the way state is in the hands of the modern elite, which is using Islam, but Islamic elite isn't there. We have never voted for for ulama into the office. And by the way, who brought MMA? It was Musharraf. I have written in my book.
Take second, please.
That's what I'm saying. MMA, who brought? I have written in my research how he managed to get madrasa people, gave them bachelor's degree, and banned others who were not bachelors, and so on. He maneuvered it, and he talked to the Americans, look, mullah in is better than mullah out. And this is how the state was moving at that time. So this is a kind of a complex question. And you also talked about, for example, Muslims in India. I'll pass if you don't mind. And then you talked about the tradition, and you said they bypassed the tradition, in fact, or confronted the tradition, or did not take the tradition into consideration when they were talking about, for example, nationalism. What I'm saying is that this is exactly what was aimed. Mahatma Gandhi was doing what? People accuse him, particularly the left, that he blocked the way to revolution by using religion. And talking, for example, he was talking to Ahmedabad industrialists, and he said he went to the capitalists, not to the trade unions who were on the street. He went to the capitalists. Look, God has given the mandate for these people to you. Please take care of them, etc. So they would patronize them. You are the father and mother, my bap, whatever they said. In other words, class conflict he tried to control. And this was exactly what the left accused him of. But we are not talking about that. Tradition, first of all, it is language-based. Second, it is sect-based or religion-based or whatever. Which was this elite? This was not that way sectarian. This was not that way localist. They wanted to build a nation. So 15, 20, 30 traditional units or societies, they wouldn't let them behave like traditional units. That's why they tried to dismantle the boundaries of the tradition, tried to melt them into a nation. There was this hunger protest for making a province in India. Nehru said no language-based province. The man died, and there was a protest, and then only he took a step back and he said, okay, language-based provinces, and now there are 28 language-based provinces, meaning thereby that you adapted, but still there is this unity. There is a cult of unity in India, cult of unity in Pakistan, and in 77 countries, because there are tribes, there are ethnic communities. They don't know how to operate as national units. That's why this obsession with unity, nationalism. But tradition, yes, but that tradition which would not question the national sort of identity. That's why Sindh wouldn't do, Sindhi identity wouldn't do, Saraiki identity wouldn't do, Pakhtun identity wouldn't do. It's the Islamic identity. Even if you have to invent one, you have to do that. That is why it serves the national purpose. And I'm sorry, there were three things here. First of all, romance with colonialism. The moment you say the educated modern people in Pakistan and in India and everywhere, they are the way they are, proto-Western. We wear Western dress in millions more numbers than we did in 1947. And we want to get into Westernized educational institutions far more than they ever did before. And we go to the West and we send our children to the West far more in numbers than we ever did. We are embracing, we know the way up is through Westernism, through Westernized, English-speaking idiom, English idiom schools and colleges and universities. We know it and we do it, and at the same time we hate the West. So if you don't want to look at the reality, face the reality, just think about things in ideal terms, that doesn't lead us to tangible sort of conclusions. Therefore, what we have to do is, we have to understand what we are doing, what we are thinking. Almost all the best research being done in Pakistan is in English, I'm sorry to say. And almost all the new younger generation, even about CSS, my students, for example, come to me and tell me, girls and boys, I'm going to England, I'll do the masters there, then I'll come back, so I'll be far better in terms of competition with others in CSS, and I'll join foreign service maybe, etc. That is the root in the minds of the younger people, and they are very clear about it, irrespective of what others, the planners or the dreamers, think. So we are anti-colonial, instinctively, ideologically, but not in a real sense. We want to go the same way. And that's why there is a whole chapter, by the way. The whole generation right now, they are a post-colonial generation. They hate colonialism. Colonialism did this. The British did this. This is colonial mentality, you know. This is the idiom of our conversation. But what are we doing? What are we doing right now here? The Western kind of debate and whatever. So and there I talked about there is a funny word, a return of the native. There is one section in my book, the return of the native. The native in us, which was struggling against the colonial masters, now, in 1 or 2 or 3 generations later, in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, what are we doing? And in other countries? Anti-colonial, that means our original pre-colonial, as if that was better than today. Look at women getting out of home, getting into the schools, getting into the professions, never possible for hundreds of thousands of years, and talk about other things. I'm corrected, thank you. And so on. So, meaning that, and in so many other ways, for example, by way of medicine, by way of whatever. Modernity. Sir, you said modernity. We were going that way, then we ditched. And 77 countries which are trying to build their nations. Nation building is the birthplace of conflict. We are conflictual in 1,001 ways, and that's harming us that way. Last point, The colonialists, why did they conquer us? So the Indian YouTubers, they are constantly talking about it, particularly because they are now hating Muslims. They conquered us and ruled us for 500, 600 years. How could they do it? And therefore, they start talking about it. This is their dilemma. How could outside? Well, it's very simple. In the British case, in the colonial case, Industrial Revolution took place, and before that, Scientific Revolution took place, and for the last 400 years or so, Kepler, if you remember, he was looking at the stars and their movements, and Columbus believed that the Earth is round. So it was from before Columbus that they believed that the Earth is round, and then later on that it is moving, Galileo, around the sun rather than sun moving around, and so on. That was the mind, that was the level of organization, that was the scientificity in the framework, and that is the production capacity, particularly technologically speaking. That is what confronted them in the colonial societies where none of this existed. That's why they collapsed. One, then the seven, then the third, then the fourth, be it Buddhist, be it Hindu, be it Islamic, any society. They simply collapsed in front of these modernist forces, particularly here, the mind, and of course the technological products. And I don't know, there is finally something, bourgeoisie, the industrial commercial elite, why isn't it doing now? And it did. It was not a very critical sort of input in the Pakistan movement, although they gave funding to Jinnah Sahib quite a bit, and that was great help. But overall, this was the political and social mobilization. The ultimate weapon in the hands of the Muslim League was the narrative of difference. Tell every Muslim that you are different from Hindu. Your employer Hindu, or employee Hindu, or friend Hindu, or neighbor Hindu is different. You are different. This is called identity construction. Jinnah Sahib got 4, 5, 6 years when the war was going on. Congress leaders were all in jail. Muslim League offered to help the British in the war and got a recruitment of hundreds of thousands of people from Punjab, cooperated with the war machinery, and those were the 5, 6 years when identity construction took place. Muslim, they said, but we are Malayalam speaking, the other Hindi speaking, the other. No, don't talk about their languages. Islam, you are Muslim. So after hundreds of years, these people got the big input from the macro level leadership and party, and the same happened with Congress, of course, but in Pakistan's case, that is how conversion of these communities took place, ideologically speaking, to the cause of Pakistan.
Thank you so much. I think we will end right here. Thank you all for your participation.